Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the US-Japan Research Institute seminar on improving policy and practice on return migration after natural disasters. I'm Katsuichi Uchida, President of this USJI and also Vice President of Massachusetts University in Tokyo. First, let me introduce USJI. USJI is a non-profit research institute here in Washington, D.C. And the USJI was established in April 2009 by leading Japanese universities. And now USJI is managed by 8 Japanese universities, namely Doshisha, Keio, Kyoto, Kyushu, Tsukuba, University of Tokyo, Ritsumeikan, and Waseda universities. And we are financially supported by both Japanese and US business societies. The mission of USJI is to promote policy-related research at our member universities, to organize research teams, dispatch their research results to a wider communities by the medium of English, to nurture young researchers relating to US-Japan issues, and to formulate a community of researchers and policymakers. USJI holds week-long seminars twice a year, March and September, and occasional seminars once or twice a month here in Washington, D.C., and sometimes we hold seminars in Japan. With regard to the details of our activities, please visit our homepage website. This week, from yesterday to Tuesday next week, we'll hold 11 different events covering a wide range of topics. And I hope that you're able to participate as many as possible. This afternoon, we have seminars on the improving policy and practice on return migration after natural disasters. And this is very interesting and sensitive and rather controversial issues. And we are very fortunate to have a group of experts on these issues. And I think there will be comparative studies and discussion on the Fukushima, Katrina, and Sandy. And I'm sure today's discussion will provide fundamentals for the further research, and also will produce fruitful and productive results. Before introducing moderator Professor Nakayama of the University of Tokyo, I would like to ask you to receive the permission of being videotaped, and that videotaped the scenario will be published through internet. So I'd like to ask Professor Nakayama to begin with.
Thank you very much, Professor Uchida, for your very kind introduction. And I'm very glad to be here today. We have been carrying out research about the issue of improving policy practices on return migration after natural disasters with participation of the American researchers and Japanese researchers, with cases in Fukushima and some of the impacted areas by Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy. And today, I will speak for some 20 minutes about my case study on Fukushima. And then Dr. Brook of the Environmental Law Institute will talk about the cases in this country by Hurricane Sandy and Katrina. And thereafter, Professor Reiner of the George Washington University will comment on our presentations and other related issues for 10 minutes. And then our floor will be open for question, answer, and comments. Having said that, let me start my presentation. well, Fukushima refugees unwilling to return. And well, the first part, I have to give you some definitions about refugees and IDPs. And refugees are people who have crossed an international frontier and at risk or have been victims of the persecution in their country of origin. On the other hand, IDP have not crossed an international frontier, but have, for whatever reasons, also fled their homes. And well, fortunately or unfortunately, these two terms, these two terms are often mixed up by mass media and or even by researchers. And in this presentation, I will not make a rigid distinction between two terms. And so how many refugees and IDPs we have in this world? And one statistics shows that we have 16 million refugees and 51 million IDPs, which implies that we have 67 million in total. It means that 1% of the world population is either refugees or IDPs. And as for IDPs, it is found that some 25 million IDPs are due to natural disasters, which means that 1% of the IDPs are due to the Great East Japan earthquake back in 2011. And well, listening to the radio or watching the television, from time to time, we found some news like this. Refugees from Liberia in Ghana do not want to come back home. Or refugees from Somalia in Kenya do not want to come back home. Or even for IDPs in Uganda, IDPs refuse to return home as camps closed down in north. And it is also the case in Fukushima or in Japan. Well, many Fukushima refugees, IDPs, wish to come back home, while they are not permitted to do so due to contamination by radioactive materials of their homeland. However, some Fukushima refugees, in this case IDPs, are permitted to come back home. So they can come back home because their homelands are decontaminated and it is safe for them to come back. But they are not necessarily willing to come back. And this is a case of our research. So we have been carrying out an international collaborative research project, and our research questions are as follows. 1, why some refugees are not willing to come back home? 2, how they could be motivated to return home? 3, what sort of measures are required to mitigate tensions between refugees and original residents in host communities? I will touch upon it later. And how absorbing capacity of a community can be estimated. And within the framework of this research project, we have two components. One is the comparison between Japanese case in Fukushima and some Asian case in Indonesia and Sri Lanka. And the other component is comparison between Japanese case and cases in the United States. And we will talk about the second category for this segment. And as for the case studies in Japan, well, we have been working on one of the town in Fukushima Prefecture called Hirono Town. It was impacted by tsunami back in 2011. And we also have case studies in South Sri Lanka, Banda Aceh in Indonesia and Padang in Indonesia, also in Indonesia. Then, refugees, Fukushima refugees unwilling to return. Some municipalities, for example, Hirono town, have declared that refugees or their townspeople may return home. However, many refugees have not returned yet, and quite a few of them have decided not to come back home, to be in somewhere else. And some speculated that these refugees will not return home as long as TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company, the owner of the Fukushima #1 nuclear power stations, which exploded, gives them compensation. However, majority of the refugees from Hirono town did not return home even after cessation of compensation by TEPCO. So many people suspected that the people will not come back as long as compensation is given to them by TEPCO. But even after cessation of the compensation by TEPCO, they didn't come back. And for you who are not familiar with Japanese geography, well, this is a Fukushima we are talking about, and Tokyo is here. And in the Fukushima prefecture, in fairly southern part, we have Hirono town, our study area. And Hirono town suffered from earthquake and subsequent tsunami back on 11th March 2011. And all the townspeople were obliged to evacuate from Hirono town to somewhere else. And they stayed in the auditorium of the school or municipality, as a municipality, for several weeks to a few months. And then they moved in to the temporary housings in various places in and around Fukushima prefecture. And as of today, out of 5,000 residences registered to the town, only 1,600 persons have come back home. Others haven't. And some 3,000 people still live in temporary housing like this. And younger people have generally moved, whether back to Hirono, very few, or to other new homes, many, while the elderly seem more likely caught in limbo. They haven't determined where to go. They haven't determined what to do. And decontamination was carried out in such a manner in Hirono town, like other municipalities impacted by explosion of the nuclear reactor. However, we carried out some preliminary interviews, and we come to believe that some inconvenient truths exist behind the scene. That is, many unwilling to return refugees defer their fear of the radioactive deposits. But principle and practice often differ, as you know well. And the fact is that in many cases, radiation level of their original residences is much lower than in temporary housing. So which means that in terms of the radiation, staying in temporary housing has more risk than coming back home. But still, they refer their fear of the radioactive deposit as a reason of their not returning home. However, radiation level may no longer be a concern. This is out of the newspaper in Japanese, published just last month. And, this is a Hirono town, and this figure in red square bracket shows the radiation of these days. And this figure shows radiation of those days, just 1 month after explosion of the nuclear reactor. And the fact is that we have many refugees in Fukushima town, Fukushima city, or Iwaki city. And as you see, Korean city, and as you see, the radiation level of the Hirono town is, to say the least, equivalent to one of the place for temporary housing, or it is much lower than in Fukushima city, where many temporary housings are there. So, this is a reality. And this also shows the radiation of the dosage in Hirono town as compared with some major cities in the world, like Munich, or Tampere, or Rotterdam. Compared with these cities, Hirono is much, much safer, or radiation level is much lower than some European cities. So what they say, what refugees say? We carried out interviews with refugees living in temporary housing in Iwaki City, which is next to the Hirono town. And these refugees now enjoy much better access to good schools, clinics, supermarkets, etc., than living in the Hirono town. And also, emancipation from in-laws is highly appreciated by housewives, which means that in the old residences, 2 or 3 generations are living in the same compound. But in the temporary housing, they have to be split into 2 or 3 houses per generation. And in former days, housewives have problems with in-laws, in particular with mother-in-laws. But such nightmare is now over because they are physically disconnected between generations. And some housewives are also very glad to have abandoned very labor-intensive rice cropping, because in these days, housewives are supposed to carry out the majority of the work for rice cultivation. And because of the inundation of the paddy field by tsunami, or because agricultural machineries were swept away by tsunami, they are now emancipated from very labor-intensive rice cropping. And there are some elements which they do not say openly. For example, as I mentioned that compensation from TEPCO to the townspeople has been terminated. However, some people in the temporary housing still believe that additional compensation may be given by TEPCO to those in the temporary housing. And they are afraid of losing the entitlement by coming back home. They believe that as long as they live in the temporary housings, they are entitled to have additional compensation if such a compensation should be given. So they are reluctant to leave temporary housing in order not to lose entitlement they believe in. And many refugees thus commute from the temporary housing to their own homes in the Hirono town just to maintain the entitlement. And well, it is very sad to mention, but conflicts between refugees and the people, citizens in the host community were very visible. And the conflicts between different cultures, between refugees and original residences have emerged in Iwaki City, where they have many temporary housings. And working poor citizens, the original citizens of the Iwaki City, envies no working rich refugees, because for refugees, approximately $1,000 of the compensation is given every month for one family member. So if you have a wife and 3 children, you will be given $5,000 by doing nothing. And in addition, your income before the disaster is also compensated. So that's what I mean. We observed. That's the very origin of the conflicts between working poor and no working rich. And also, the waiting time to consult a doctor or dentist is now as long as 3 hours, which used to be almost 0. And all dentists are full of new patients or refugees. And rental houses and apartment house has skyrocketed because these houses and apartment houses are also used for temporary housings of the refugees. And because of the skyrocketing rent for apartment houses and houses, local people, original residences of New York City suffer from the sudden hike of the rent. And we organized an international symposium in Hirono Town in just 2 months ago. And these are, statements expressed by local people, like, I know why others do not come back home. They love the convenience to live in a city, which is expressed by one of the junior high school students. And more people should come back if the town becomes more convenient. We had many concerns to come back home. Such a concerns disappeared once we are back in home. It's a testimony by a housewife who came back to the town. And I wish we had an arena to exchange opinions frankly among ourselves. Or townspeople in temporary housing need to talk within family whether they will come back or not. So this is the last slide of mine. What kind of measures are possible? What kind of measures to be taken? One, the radiation dosage, not radiation level of the places, but radiation dosage of on human body should be measures for those who live in the temporary housing and those who have come back home, in order to show that coming back home is safe or safer than staying in the temporary housing. And the TEPCO, or the government of Japan, should make the compensation policy for refugees clear and final so that they can make their mind. And also, alternative and more convenient transport system between Hirono Town and the nearby city, in this case, Iwaki City, should be made available, like on-demand bus, which is widely used in various municipalities in Japan. And also, cost to be incurred by lack of frank discussion. For example, local government cannot carry out any effective measures without learning the real demand of the refugees. Should be made clear to the citizens. Well, today I'm showing kind of interim progress report of the project, and we plan to have yet another seminar in half a year time in Washington again to show the findings or lessons learned. But today I'm very happy to inform you of the progress of the research we are carrying out. Thank you very much. So, could somebody change this?
Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to see everyone here. I'm wondering, did anyone here experience either Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy firsthand? I confess that I did not experience either, but my sister-in-law's family is from Louisiana, and my mother is from the northern New Jersey coast, and so I followed these events very closely, and it affected a number of our family members and friends. Hurricane Katrina made landfall in August of 2005. The satellite photos were just amazing, seeing almost the entire Gulf of Mexico covered by one storm. And it hit a city that was already underwater, literally. And they had been holding back the water with levees. Unfortunately, 53 of these levees breached, submerging 80% of the city, 80. And it also devastated coastal towns across the Gulf of Mexico. More than 1,800 people were killed, displacing more than 2 million people, including 400,000 from New Orleans. Caused more than $100 billion in damage. And less than a month later, Hurricane Rita hit, and that was even stronger. 4 years later, I should note that what we're looking at is not the immediate displacement, it's the question of long-term, people who get caught in limbo. 4 years later, more than 30,000 households, 7% of the New Orleans population, hadn't come back, hadn't moved on. They were caught in limbo. And the question is, why? Why? There's some people who are displaced temporarily to Houston and said, I'll never leave New Orleans. New Orleans is home. It's got the culture. So, Houston's not that bad. It doesn't quite have the culture, but there are more jobs. The schools are better. I think I'll stay. But there are a lot of people who really weren't able to stay. So I should note that this work has been done in collaboration with Nick Briner. And in reviewing the literature, we found a number of reasons for why people return and why they don't return. And some of these, you kind of look at one side or the other and say, this is interesting. So the primary reasons for returning, one was financial. That if you had more income, you were more likely to return because you were more able to return. That you could invest in fixing the place up. And I should also note that the nicer neighborhoods in New Orleans, the older neighborhoods, those were built on land that was above sea level. You look at the map of New Orleans in 1900, and the areas that flooded were almost all the areas that in 1900 didn't have people in them. They built on the land that was higher, and over years they filled in, developed the swampland, and that was the area that was poor, and that was the area that was more vulnerable. And you saw that from the 2004 to 2006, the price of housing increased by 50%. So that's before the storm and after the storm. Because there was less housing available, a lot of people trying to stay there, it became more expensive to stay in New Orleans. The second substantial reason that we saw was a sense of community, and especially home ownership. That's a financial dimension, but there's also a community ties within New Orleans. And finally, the loss of temporary housing. You look, reason to return, loss of temporary housing. Reason not to return, loss of temporary housing. Basically, when you lost temporary housing, you had to make a decision. Am I going back? Am I staying? Am I going back or am I moving on? You couldn't stay in limbo, or it was harder to stay in limbo. And so that tended to force a decision. Other reasons for not returning were financial, especially for people who were lower income. Employment. New Orleans didn't have the same sort of job opportunities. It had the community, it had home, it had history, but it didn't have the same job opportunities. And the other aspect here was risk. It's not the same sort of risk of exposure that you have in Fukushima prefecture, but it was the risk that another storm would come. And storms had come through the years, but never a direct hit by a Category 5 or even Category 4 hurricane. But but there was this concern about it would happen again. We're going to jump to Hurricane Sandy and then take a step back and look at some of the policy options and their implications. Hurricane Sandy hit from October 22nd to October 29, 2012. You'll remember this was days before the presidential election. And this is, you see Florida down there, just the whole eastern seaboard covered by Hurricane Sandy. Most of the damage was in the Northeast. And homes burned, houses flooded and moved, subways in New York flooded. Not nearly the same extent of loss of life as in New Orleans. Only about 147 direct deaths, with half of those in the US, and another 87 indirect deaths in the US. Substantial damage in the US, 5 times that in the Caribbean. 650,000 homes were damaged or destroyed, and 8.5 million people were left without power, sometimes for months, often weeks. A year later, you still have more than 30,000 people displaced. And this affected the presidential race. Similar criteria have been seen in the literature for why people return and why they don't. Financial investment, financial capacity, sense of community, and jobs. This, I think, is, remember, jobs was the reason why people left New Orleans. Here you have the financial sector and a lot of other jobs, a lot of well-paying jobs that are based in that area. So that's part of the reason that people stayed. They had to stay. There was a strong incentive. Reasons given for not returning: the financial costs, flood insurance underpayments, buyouts, and again, the risk of another similar disaster. I'm going to talk a little about flood insurance and buyouts anon. So we saw 4 primary policies that tended to influence whether people returned. One was tax exemptions. We have a long history in this country of using the tax code to encourage or discourage actions. You want to encourage people to go to college? Make their student loans tax-free. Similarly, you want to encourage people to move back to New Orleans? You can use tax exemptions to reduce the economic burden. Changing of building codes. We saw this especially after Hurricane Sandy, that if you had a house in particular areas and you wanted to rebuild, you couldn't have a basement. You had to lift it above a certain level. And this is not cheap. Friends of ours saw this $500,000 just to essentially lift the house up, renovate it. It took a long time, which meant that a lot of the inside stuff, you had issues with mold. So the changing of the building codes reduces future vulnerability, but it requires that people often make substantial financial investments. Buyouts. This was something that when you see the same sort of disaster happening time and again, you say, maybe we should encourage people to move away. Maybe it's not in the national interest, in the state interest, to keep paying people to rebuild. We don't want to encourage people to put themselves in vulnerable positions. So after Katrina, it was suggested as a wide-scale approach along the Gulf Coast, but it's only done in limited ways. It was used much more extensively after Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast. And generally, people would be paid 110% of the value of their house. So, it's your value plus a little extra to encourage you to do it, to move. And that would decrease state and federal, I don't want to say liability, but risk, financial risk, in terms of disaster response. And if you're in a high-risk area, they'll pay double the cost, double the value. And in many cases, the homes were then demolished to allow the land to return to marshlands, which provides a buffer against storm surges and such. The final, and I should also note, on the buyouts, after Katrina, noted professor in Tulane University in New Orleans suggested that the US government buy a 400-meter, I guess it was a 400-yard buffer zone along the Gulf Coast, and to turn that into an area where a natural buffer, it can help buffer against storms, provide for destinations. And it was, people considered it for about 15 seconds until the coastal community said, "You're going to kill us." And so that idea of having a broader scale buffer was quickly dropped. But it's something that has been put on the table, and I expect will continue to be put on the table each time you get a major disaster that creates billions, tens of billions of dollars of cost to communities, states, and the national government. The final area that we saw a lot of dialogue and attempts at action was in the National Flood Insurance Program. Basically, the National Flood Insurance Program says that if you designate areas that are prone to floods and you take certain measures, we will essentially, the national government will subsidize the insurance process. And the problem is that the plans were not reflective of reality, and they actually encouraged people to build in risky areas. And after multiple disasters in the Midwest, in the Gulf Coast, and elsewhere, there were suggestions following Katrina to change the National Flood Insurance Program, which would shift development substantially. This was not done. After Sandy, there finally was the political will to do that. The bill was passed, it was signed by President Obama, and about a year later, homeowners were saying, "We're bearing all the cost." And so there's been a rollback of those reforms. So what does all this mean? Well, economic tools, price signals, can be effective, but they're really politically charged, especially if you're trying to discourage return, trying to discourage people from either coming back or even encouraging them to move if they survived. It is possible to buy people out. It hasn't been done on a large scale, presumably because of the cost and also to some extent because of the politics. And I think there's an interesting distinction to be made between changes regarding how people rebuild and where people rebuild. It's a lot easier, it's still politically charged and difficult to change the building codes. But at least the choice is given that people can stay. When you say, these people can no longer live here, you can't come back, or if you're here, you have to leave, that's when it gets really politically charged. I want to end on a positive note. Disasters compel people to think about how we are organizing our societies. Is there a better way of doing it? Sometimes building back the same way is not prudent. Financially, it's not really possible. And so if we step back and say, what are the problems in our existing development and in our existing development plans? You can identify better ways of building back, not just building back differently, but building back better. It takes courage to do it, But we see with certain aspects of New York and New Jersey, communities are starting to do that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bullock. Now, I'll listen to the comments by Professor Bryan. Go.
Thank you. So thanks to Professor Nakayama and Dr. Brook for their presentations, and thanks also to Dr. Uchida for welcoming us here today. So I have a few comments in response to the discussions that you've raised and points that you've raised, and particularly with regard to potential policy decisions for how to deal with disasters in these two particular case studies and in general and for future examples. And I want to talk about a couple of thoughts in relation to that, about how once you identify the policy goals are that you have in mind, whether to encourage people to return or not to return, or to return to a particular place and not to other places, then how are you going to go about making that policy effective and incentivizing people to come up with the results that you want, and how to also alleviate the concerns and particular challenges that they face. So in that regard, there are it's kind of challenging to draw lessons from these two examples because of a number of differences in how you might want to tailor those policies for different people that are in different circumstances. And obviously Japan and the Fukushima is a special example because of the radiation, kind of as an additional concern for people, in addition to risk of flooding from future tsunamis, or risk from, those are kind of similar types of risks, the tsunami and hurricane types of risk, whereas the nuclear disaster is in a different element for people to deal with. In looking at the literature in Katrina and Hurricane Katrina and Rita, I think there are some interesting examples, and I want to talk about one study in particular went through looking at several dimensions of people's decision-making processes about whether to return. And they talk about how factors that people use to decide whether to return and how to return are very much interconnected. There are some objective factors, and there are also subjective factors. And people really do engage in a deliberate process to balance those objective and subjective factors that affect them. And then there's an additional dimension of whether people are, the variations in people's circumstances, geographic differences, age, home ownership. It's a major issue, as to what their investment level in that particular area is, whether they own a home or whether they're renting in that area before, and people's wealth. Some of these factors have already been mentioned. But this study on Katrina and Rita interviewed a number of people in both rural and urban areas, inside and outside of New Orleans. And they discussed that there's really a hierarchy of factors, in the sense that there are some central factors that everybody grapples with and are really connected to all the other factors that go into determining whether they do or don't return. But most prominently is concerns about family. And so, what is it that their family members are doing? What are the concerns associated with their immediate and extended families? And also housing, and then also work. But those two, are perhaps subservient to issues of family. And like I said, family doesn't exist in and of itself, because maybe it's the family member's job that's an issue, or maybe it's the family member's house that's an issue. So those can be, tied in relation to one another. But a number of from their experience in this study of Katrina and Rita, the factors like age and education and health and infrastructure and other opportunities were less connected to each other, and perhaps less central in terms of explaining how everybody made decisions as a whole. So this, to me, I thought was interesting, because it is a little bit of a contrast to the experiences in Hirono, and particularly in meeting with people that are still in temporary housing locations more than 3 years afterwards. You have an overwhelmingly, or at least more skewed toward an elderly population, people who are still stuck in limbo. But in terms of thinking about how to address those factors, I want to respond a little bit to both of those presentations, but also in particular to Dr. Brooks' point that we're talking about long-term issues of whether you do or don't return. But I think it's useful to consider how short-term measures and how planning even in advance of disasters can really be linked to what kinds of options you end up with in the long term. And particularly with regard to families, I think this is an important point to consider, and it would be worth examining further what kinds of policies could you do in the short-term aftermath of a disaster to keep family and social structures in place as much as possible so that you don't have the types of disruptions in the long term that maybe you end up with. And this is, perhaps possibly a challenge in how you deal with creating temporary housing structures, trying to do it in a way that kind of maximizes the social structures that are already existing. And in that way, maybe you help people with creating an easier transition back to their home by realizing that they still have some of the same systems. As for work, there may be some other social factors that counterbalance against that. You might not want to discourage people from getting work elsewhere just for their own benefit, even if that might make it more likely for them to return. But I think there are a number of issues to look at there. And I think there are, a lot of good opportunities to rethink about what we've learned from these examples on how they might be useful for dealing with future disasters. So what kind of plans do you need to put in place beforehand so that you know how you're going to address the long-term issues that will inevitably come up 3 or 4 or 5 years afterwards. And that's something that's certainly going to be a challenge in the immediate aftermath of a disaster to maintain that longer-term perspective, but it's certainly important. So those are my comments for now, but thank you again for those presentations.
Thank you very much, Professor Breimer, for your comments. Now, floor is open for comments or questions. And please raise your hand and please come to the microphone for recording purposes, and if you may, identify yourself. So, floor is open. Yes, sir?
Thank you for that discussion on 2 different disasters. My name is David Boone. I've worked in this field through the United States Navy for 30 years. There was a slide earlier that talked about incentives for return migration, tax, insurance. And what came to mind, because we've been working on it recently, is how do you shape policy to affect change with regard to climate change and sea level rise? And Dr. Breimer kind of touched on it. How do you plan ahead of disasters? And at least for waterborne disasters, sea level rise is going to play into that equation. And all the factors that were on that particular slide were identical to ones that we had been looking at for sea level rise. So I would offer that in addition to return migration, you could address a topic on migration ahead of natural disasters. As equally important, given what is going on, whether it's sea level rise, I think the future, in our future, there will be mass migrations of all kinds, whether it's energy shortages, water, and it will be throughout the world. And so you can either wait for the disaster to happen, or we as peoples can try to become more proactive ahead of a disaster and think about what are those incentives to create a natural progression to encourage behaviors that create resiliency. And I'll take my comment off the line.
Thank you very much. Dr. Bo, do you have some comment?
I completely agree with Admiral Boone's comments that it's best to get out in front of these things. And there are a lot of processes underway, often at the state level, to think about, as a state, how are we going to adapt to climate change? And I've participated in Maryland Climate Change Commission's Adaptation Response Working Group, where they said, especially east of Interstate 95, a lot of low-lying areas. How do we prepare? And not just disasters, but just how do we, do we have rolling easements? Does that mean that, if we tell people that they can't buffer, that they can't bunker against encroaching sea, is that a taking? Do we have to pay for that? If roads wash out, do we have to rebuild them? Those sorts of questions are, in many cases, being addressed by many people. What we're seeing, we see a gap in not just policy, but also in thinking for some of these really big-term, big-picture issues. And it's easier to think about rural areas and how do you lose coastal properties and how do you prepare for that. What's hard are cities that are set. And it's unthinkable to move New Orleans, to shrink it until suddenly you have to think about it. And I think it's best to be getting out in front of it. And there are different processes of that. But there's also this question, after the disaster, what do you do? And so we're trying to fill what we see as a lacuna in the thinking and policy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Borg. And as for migration in preparation for next disaster, is what some municipalities are planning in Japan, like moving the majority of the facilities of the municipalities to higher areas, like on the top of the hill. But we observed the conflicts between interest of the municipalities and the interest of the citizens, in particular fishermen. And in that region, they suffer from tsunami, say, once in a century. But in some areas, they found some stones on the slope next to the lowland area, saying that no building should be built below this stone. But however, as the memory of the previous disaster faded away, that they tend to build more houses in the lowland, forgetting about the lessons which should be learned. And we may be doing the same right now, because many municipalities suggest to move the citizens away from the coastal zones into a safer area in highland. But people are not quite keen to move away due to various reasons. Well, again, yes, Madam, please speak to the microphone, please.
My name is India Owen. I'm an independent writer. I want to mention that I think it was a couple years ago, I attended an event at the Cultural Center sponsored by the Japanese Embassy. At that event, the mayor of a village spoke about the experiences of his community. I'm sorry I don't remember the name of the village, but I remember it had been selected before the disaster as one of the model villages in Japan, as it was considered kind of like the Platonic ideal of a village. One of the best villages in the whole country. Anyway, this mayor was very, very committed to keeping his people together, psychologically, if not physically. And I asked him later, do they plan to go back? Do they still keep in touch? He said he knows exactly where every single one, his whole village is living. They're all in touch. And it sounded like they were going to do something together. I don't know what finally happened. But you mentioned individual families making decisions. Do you encounter cases where a community is able to keep that kind of cohesion and make a decision as a community?
Well, your question relates to the decision making by community or by municipality, and very simply put, it is very tough because they now live in different locations, and their affection to their original places are fading away. And I interviewed the managemental staff of the several temporary housings, and what impressed me was like this. Shortly after their moving into the temporary housing, they asked the management how soon they may come back home. It was what they want or what they felt that time. But as time passes, their question changed to the one that how long we may stay here. Mm-hmm. So apparently, as time passes, their interest of coming back home is fading away. Mm-hmm. And it also implies that, communal decision is becoming harder to make.
I think that there's also a scale question. When you have smaller communities, I think there's more of a public town hall opportunity. New Orleans or New York, hundreds of thousands or millions of people, it's a different dynamic. You did see New York getting out in front of this, developing a climate adaptation program and trying to do this not in response to a disaster, but coming at it from a deliberative, consultative sort of process. And so I think it's some variant is possible in bigger cities, but it's a lot harder because of the sheer number of people.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Professor Charlie, could you speak to the microphone? Because this is recorded.
All right. My name is Michael Chernan. I work at Brookings, and for many years I work on issues of population displacement. The two presentations today made many interesting points, but the most interesting and unexpected that a number of people who were relocated temporarily were expected to return, did not return. In other types of development or displacement, like it happens when we build infrastructure and we displace a lot of people, often, although there is a slow onset, there is a lot of time until the displacement takes place, and we know in advance. Nonetheless, the preparation of the arrival place of those who have to be displaced falls back in time, is not done properly, and the people are relocated kind of an improvised manner in bad conditions. And I can give a lot of examples from many countries in Asia, for instance, and elsewhere. And people who are relocated there in barracks and camps because houses were not built in time for them, and land was not prepared, and so on. Cannot wait to return back. So I'm intrigued. What occurred here in the cases of the people who did not want to return, although they were expected? What made them stay? It's an unanticipated result. But as a matter of fact, this unanticipated result is an indicator of very successful resettlement. which is a fata morgana in so many other situations. We run after, recipes on how to resettle people properly and for them to be content. And in most cases, in development displacement, we fail. So if here such things happen, wouldn't we be interested to study the unexpected, to understand the causes which enable those people to make a voluntary choice to not return? And then perhaps we can succeed to pattern the unexpected, to replicate the set of conditions which made those people to stay, and we'll find a key to successful relocation in other places. So along this reasoning, I'd like to ask the people who spoke today, presented, to give indicate some details. What do you think were the complex of circumstances which encouraged those people to stay, although it was unexpected for them, no one anticipated the disaster, they didn't make plans to go there, and they found themselves relocated unexpectedly and unplanned, and nonetheless they decided to stay. There must be something of interest here for us to study and to capture the grain of news, the grain of unexpected unexpected success, which can possibly be replicated. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think there are a few factors at play here, and it seems from our experience in meeting with people from some particular community, I think there are some factors that you could replicate, but there are some things that maybe are different for different people and might be hard to bring up again. I think one of the factors is that you have people who really kind of disrupted their normal family relationship, and that was one of the reasons why they would be willing to move on to somewhere else, particularly for elderly people in communities that previously had lived with extended families. If the extended family wasn't willing to go back, then they probably weren't willing to go back as well, because they weren't really very equipped to do that on their own. So that encouraged people to move on. One of the other factors is in some of these communities there may not have been enough employment opportunities to begin with. And if you move people from somewhere that's perhaps a little bit more rural or economically depressed into an area where there were more economic opportunities and more infrastructure, more health services available, more educational opportunities, then the people would be more likely to want to stay. But in probably the cases that you're mentioning, that was probably not the case, probably not often the case for these planned relocations to move people from an area that would perhaps be less desirable economically to an area that's more desirable economically. But that being said, there are some lessons about how you could do that in terms of trying to make sure that there are access to services that people need as you relocate them.
Answering a slightly different question, I think it'd be very interesting to look at the implications of those choices, not why they've chosen now, but also looking at what the long-term implications are. So 20 years, 30 years from now, how well off are the children who stayed in Hirono Town? How well off are the children at the same age who went off to Fukushima or to Koyama or to Tokyo, went to a different school system? I think there are a lot of reasons why people stay. I grew up in a rural town in Wisconsin, actually outside a rural town in Wisconsin. 173 people in my graduating class, 5 of us went to school out of state. Everyone stays because that's what you do. This is your community, this is your identity. And I think there's some very interesting questions about why did we have a quarter of Hirono Town come back? What were their motivations? Why were they not afraid of the problems that the other 3 quarters are afraid of? And I think that raises some very interesting questions. And I also think there's some interesting questions. So what? what does this mean in the long run?
Yeah, and well, the point you raised is a point about research agenda. And well, I will give you some my experiences in carrying out interviews with the residents. And well, we had opportunity to meet, say, some 20 refugees in one of the temporary housings. And they are very talkative about their fear over the radiation, or convenience of the temporary housing, etc. But I asked them one simple question. Are you talking within your family about what to do, when to leave the temporary housing and where to go? And silence prevailed, because for the many people, they lived in a Hirono town, in a single house or in a single quarter by 3 generations, and they have taken it as granted that they live in there for good or for the time being. But once they are in temporary housing, the younger generation found the temporary housing more convenient, more employment opportunities, opportunities for children for good schools. So, if I'm say I have my parents and the children in temporary housing, someday I have to tell my parents that I will not come back. I will stay here, or I will go to Tokyo or other municipalities. And it certainly destroys my relation with my parents. And I sense that it's what many people are afraid of. And the answer, well, they have to make their mind sometime. But they're reluctant to do so. And 3 years have passed. They are not answering to this particular question. So the point is that the majority of them have not decided yet where to go. They are simply reluctant to give clear answer, or to have a clear answer within the family, in order to not destroy the family relation. And it may be a bit particular in the Japanese society, but it is what I sensed, and I gathered information and found that they are afraid of breaking the family ties, and that's the reason why they are in limbo. They haven't determined what to do within the family. It is the best answer I can give you at this stage.
Just to comment, if I may, again.
Please, because it is recorded.
I accept the responses which were given. But once again, I have worked many years at the World Bank and looking on major infrastructural projects which have displaced tens of thousands of people, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, and had enormous problems with relocating them in proper conditions, and people wanted to return. But in the case of development or displacement, you cannot go back, because if you are displaced from the reservoir of a dam, there is no land to go back to, there is water. If there was, for a highway, again, there is a highway, you cannot go back, sit on the highway. So over there, but the observations which were made here pointed to various possible cases, and all of them seems plausible. But we are speaking here about the research which Professor Nakayama did over a situation and presented interesting data with some regularities. And I'd like to say that the idiosyncratic, it's worth exploration. It's not, of course you can imagine one cause or another and give a possibility, maybe that, maybe the other. But this is what the research can do, and perhaps there is a chance to go back and to focus on a mini study just on a number of people or families who didn't want to return, and to try to identify, to distill the generality, the commonalities in these cases, and distill from the idiosyncratic what could be the regular if we proceed in an organized manner in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Czerny, for your comments, and we will keep your comments in mind in our further carrying out our study. And I observed one hand raised by the lady. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Danielle Dannenberg. I'm with the International Organization for Migration, IOM. You each spoke a lot about government policy responses in providing immediate relief, but also being mindful of long-term consequences. What role do you see for international aid and international development organizations, who are often the ones who are physically moving people and providing immediate solutions? What role do you see for them in considering long-term solutions or in being present in the long term? Thank you.
I think that as a general matter, just thinking about where IOM or the UNHCR, High Commissioner for Refugees, those sorts of organizations, where do they play a role? There's the immediate needs, and people are displaced by disaster, they come back. There's a whole set of literature on that. We're thinking about the longer term. There are, humanitarian response is generally ideologically and conceptually viewed as an emergency. You're trying to keep the patient alive. It's a short-term thing, and the longer-term issues, those are development issues. That's the theory. But we're finding that more than half of our humanitarian aid budget goes to long-term disasters, long-term displacement in Sudan, Afghanistan, in a range of these countries where you have large populations displaced for significant periods of time, largely because of conflict. We recognize that those exist. We're trying to start with the easy ones, the natural disasters and accidents. This is an area we would like to do further research in. I think that some of it depends on whether you're talking about long-term displacement of IDPs, internally displaced persons, or long-term displacement of refugees across national borders. There's often a real reluctance to think about settling the displaced persons from Sudan into Chad. The Chadians don't want a couple 100,000 refugees becoming new citizens. So I think that I think that there is, in terms of long-term return and policy and approaches, I think that that's a very delicate issue when you're dealing with refugees. Internally displaced persons, I think there's some real room there for discussion between IOM, UNHCR, and, say, UNDP and the national counterparts in how you manage displaced persons in Darfur, especially where you don't have sufficient carrying capacity for the water table. You don't have long-term, you have real long-term issues if you're talking about how is this city going to survive when the city is essentially an agglomeration of internally displaced persons. So I think that there might be more political opportunities to discuss what are policy options and actions that the international community can take on long-term return or non-return for IDPs. For refugees, I haven't had a chance to really think about that and how to encourage that, because usually, from a budgetary perspective, you want them to go back. You don't have that much money. You want, so as soon as they can go back, you want them to go back. The reason they're not going back is they're still in danger. And so what are your options? And I don't think we've come up with a good solution, or we would have implemented it.
Thank you.
I guess I would just maybe add one extra point to that, is that I think that's a really important question in relation to what the first question was about climate change and sea level rise. And there's probably a role for international organizations in terms of thinking about how people are going to move ahead of disasters on a larger scale, and that's something that probably needs to be thought of, and international organizations may be in a position to think about that in a way that might apply in different circumstances, in a way that an individual community or an individual country might not be able to think of with the global application.
Thank you. Any more questions, comments? Yes, madam.
Excuse me, my name is Megan Hoswright. I'm with the National Fire Protection Association. And I was wondering, we've been involved a lot in the resiliency discussion, and there are a number of different organizations working on that. And it seems like from an engineering perspective, we're moving towards being able to really make different systems more resilient. But to what degree is the type of data that your research is looking into being used to help policymakers make sort of the normative decisions of what resiliency means? Does it mean, within a month this will be a functioning community? Does it mean within, and to be able to present that to policymakers to say, listen, here's what we know within 3 weeks. If you don't have certain systems back online, you'll lose, this many residents typically won't come back. Your businesses will, falter. How is that being sort of fed back into the policy process?
We're trying to, right now we're at the point of saying, what are we learning? I expect that in about a year, 9 months to a year, we will have more of those action-oriented, take what we've learned and turn it around and say, so what does this mean for policy and practice? The sorts of questions you're asking are really the sorts of questions we want to be able to answer. We're not yet there.
Yeah, well, just add that, in the next seminar, say half a year time from now, we'll be in a better position to give you some answers, if not all the questions. Thank you. Any other questions, comments? No. Okay, then before closing this session, I wonder if, commentator or speaker has a final comments or no?
No, nothing.
I think our thinking has evolved over the life of this project. At first there was a question, how do people think about whether to return and whether to not return, whether to move on? And one of the things that we've learned in this project is that there really are 3 categories. There are people who decide they're going to go back. There are people who decide, I'm going to move on. And then there are people who just can't make a decision. Or they have decided that they're going to stay in limbo because that's the best offer they have. But I think that it's important to recognize that there are these 3 or even 4 categories of people, and as a general matter, we're not advocating people should return or people should move on. It really depends case by case, and even within a particular disaster, there will be some where it's best for those people to return, and some where this is not an appropriate place to return to, or you want to return but you have to do things differently. I wanted to be clear, we're not saying anything about the normative, people should return, people should not return. It's more, once that decision has been made, how do you nudge people in that particular direction? And that's a combination of laws and policies. It also needs to take into account psychology and sociology and economics. And I think that's one of the things we've been seeing is that those all those factors are there, and there are some tools that we've seen that are rather promising. I think there's the one area that I stay tuned for are what do we think are missing? What are the sorts of, not just how can we do this, buyout, how can we do buyouts better? We know about buyouts, but are there other tools that we should be thinking about more proactively or in response that people really haven't tried it in a meaningful way?
Well, thank you very much. And before closing this session, first of all, please let me express my sincere thanks for Dr. Brooke and Professor Briner for their taking role of speaker and commentator. And I thank the audiences today for your very active participation in the discussions, which I quite I enjoyed, and I was very glad that we organized this seminar today. So I shall close this seminar, and once again, thank you very much for your participation.